podcast. I'm Michaela Peterson, Jordan's daughter. I hope you enjoy this episode. It's called Abraham, a Father of Nations. If you want to check out understandmyself.com and look at your personality, you should check it out if you haven't heard of it. You can use code Michaela, Mikhaila. Thank you, Dad, for naming me after Mikhail Gorbachev so that nobody can Google my name. It's around $8 anyway, and it's worth it. I scored 98th percentile on volatility and 2nd percentile on politeness. Beat that. I'm not proud of either of those, by the way, but it explains a lot. I released a podcast last week on the Michaela Peterson podcast with Dr. Jason Fung on fasting benefits. If you're a fatty, I'd check it out. That's my 2nd percentile on politeness coming out. But seriously, if you're looking into how to get healthier, and maybe you don't want to go on an all-beef lion diet or even low carb, although you should, you can get similar benefits from fasting, and I'd really recommend it. I finished a week-long fast a few weeks ago, and it was heavenly. I have a video documenting the experience on YouTube, actually, if you'd rather see that. Anyway, I hope you enjoy this podcast. Everyone is thinking about health these days. In addition to improving your health here and now, you can also improve your health span, which is the number of years you live disease-free as you age. Dad and I have been attempting to do this by getting NAD treatments. In our case, these treatments have also resulted in improved mood and energy level, and I've been getting an energetic buzzing feeling in a good way. The only downside is that these treatments involve being hooked up to an IV for 8 hours. If you don't have the time or patience for that, a great alternative is a supplement called Basis, produced by the company Elysium. Basis works by increasing your NAD levels and activating what scientists call our longevity genes. Many of the benefits of NAD are things you won't feel, like enhanced mitochondrial function, active longevity genes, and improved DNA repair. But Basis customers also report experiencing higher energy, better sleep, and more satisfying workouts. Plus, it's easy. Just take 2 capsules a day to improve the way you age. Listeners can get 10% off of a monthly subscription to Basis by visiting trybasis.com/Jordan and using the promo code Jordan10. That's trybasis.com/Jordan and the promo code Jordan10. That's a great deal on a groundbreaking supplement. Season 3, Episode 10, Abraham, a Father of Nations, a Jordan B. Peterson lecture.
Hello, everyone. It's been a very strange day. So I'm going to tell you about what happened, and then I'll start the lecture. So I got up this morning and started to put my day together, and then I tried to sign into my Gmail account, and it said that it had been disabled because I violated the terms of service with Gmail. And I thought, well, I didn't violate any terms of service that I know of. Now, I set up a new YouTube channel yesterday called Jordan B. Peterson Clips, and so we made some technical changes, and so I thought maybe it had something to do with that. And I had been shut out of Google one other time, years ago. So when you get shut out like that, there's a little form you can fill out. And so I filled out the form, and I said that I had been shut out, and that I didn't know why, and I sent it off. And then I realized one of my staff members called me and said that she was locked out of the YouTube account. And I thought, oh yeah, the YouTube account is hooked to the Gmail account. So that meant that I couldn't get access to any of my YouTube videos. They were still up and online, but I couldn't get access to them. I couldn't post last week's biblical lecture, for example. And so that was worrisome and made me suspicious. And then about 2 hours later, something like that, I got an email from Google, and they said that they had reviewed my request to be reinstated, and that I had violated Google's terms of agreement or terms of service, and they weren't going to turn my account back on. And I thought, and they didn't say why. They didn't say anything. There was no warning whatsoever about any of this. They didn't tell me why. And they didn't say why in the email response. And so I wrote them back and I said, because they said I could, I wrote them back and I said, this might not be a good idea, basically. And you might want to think about it. And then I tweeted what had happened, right? I took screenshots and I tweeted, and I contacted a whole bunch of journalists, because it turns out that I know a whole bunch of journalists. And so then what happened then was that I got a call from the Daily Caller in the United States. I had done an interview with them last week, which isn't posted yet. And they interviewed me, and within 20 minutes posted it online. And so they have a fairly big audience, and so that was good. And then somebody phoned me from Ottawa, and I did a live radio show about that, and that was good. And then a number of other journalists contacted me, and I sent them the information. But another one of my staff, actually my son, emailed me, and he said, look, you should hold off because maybe there's still a mistake here. And I thought, yeah, there might be. It might be just a mistake, but then why in the world did I email Google? And they contacted me, and they said they would not reinstate it, and they didn't provide me with any information. So I contacted the other journalists, and I said, well, you never know, maybe this is just a mistake, so let's hold off. And then, I was about half an hour later, while I was trying to get into I used this AdWords account that's linked to Google. I don't run ads on my videos, but I need the AdWords account because it helps me add some little gadgets to the videos that I wouldn't otherwise be able to. And I was playing with that, the system came back online. I thought, well, that's interesting. And lots of people had emailed me and Twittered me, and some people within Google and some people elsewhere, and they were doing whatever they were going to do to help me get all this material back up and running. And so something worked. My suspicions are that what worked was the publicity. Now, but maybe not, and it's very weird being in this situation, because there has been a number of recent episodes where these larger companies, Facebook, Google, Patreon, not that it's a massive company, but it's starting to become reasonably significant, have decided on rather arbitrary grounds to shut down their users. And this is very ominous to me, partly because we've turned our communications over to very large systems, or very large systems have emerged to mediate our communication, right? I mean, there's lots of benefit to it, so you don't want to get too cynical about it. But we're blind with regards to the policies that regulate the actions, the regulatory actions of these large organizations, and that's really a bad thing. And something else is even more ominous, really ominous, It's highly probable that we're going to build political algorithms into our artificial intelligence, and this sort of thing will be regulated by machines that no one understands. And that's a really bad idea, and that's a really likely possibility. So anyways, I was all confused about this. I thought, Jesus, maybe I flew off the handle, because I was it was stressful, man, because I have like 150,000 emails in that account. Like, that's a lot of emails, and it's all my correspondence for the last 10 years, so it's an archive as well as an ongoing email system. I have a commercial email system that I just set up 3 weeks ago with like 6 different email addresses now to try to organize my correspondence, so I wasn't completely unable to communicate, but my calendar was gone, and that's a bloody disaster, because like I've got things scheduled out forever, and I don't remember what they are. I can't even remember what I'm doing in a day, so much less in a month. But I thought maybe I flew off the handle, and I was worried that I contacted the journalist too soon, and but anyways, it all worked out. So then what happened? Well, just as I was coming to this lecture, I stepped outside, and there was a little package outside. And luckily, it wasn't a bomb. And there was a package outside, nice little package. And my wife and I looked inside it, and there was a couple of bottles of wine in there. So that was nice. And there was a little note. And so I'm going to read you the little note, because it's actually pretty interesting. So this person said that they had finally tackled the self-authoring suite, so they seem to be happy about that, but that's not so interesting except peripherally. A friend on Twitter has contact with Google engineers. She said, quote, I spoke with some friends inside Google who offered to help, and I did get contacted by quite a few people at Google who said that they had been, watching my lectures and so on, and were happy about what I was doing. Anyways, I spoke with some friends inside Google who offered to help, but they suggest he set up a backup plan. The teams are feeling significant pressure from advocacy groups. And, quote, I have at least 4 Google engineers who offered to speak up on his behalf, but they know the team dynamics, and unfortunately, especially YouTube, is an SJW cesspool. I hope this information is useful to you. It's like, yeah, it's kind of useful, all right. So that was part of what happened today. And so, anyways, I still don't really understand it, right? Because I don't know why it got shut down, and I don't know if anything I did got it turned back on, and I don't know the reasons for it, and that's also rather ominous. It seems to me that when I was thinking it through, and was that, I have a fairly, what would you call it, respectable YouTube following. I don't know if you'd necessarily call it respectable. It's a fairly large YouTube following. And it seems to me that it would have been appropriate for Google, if they were going to shut down my account, to tell me why, I would think, and also maybe look me up, maybe, especially after I emailed them, and then maybe not to have emailed me back and said, no, we're not going to reinstate you, but we're not going to tell you any reasons. They didn't say they wouldn't tell me any reasons. They just didn't tell me any reasons. And then it also seems very strange to me that it just all of a sudden went back on after 2 hours. And so I don't know what to make of that. Maybe more information will come to light over the next few days. I hope that I didn't jump the gun, but it's a very peculiar set of circumstances. I thought it was kind of amusing, actually, that the video that they stopped me from posting today was the last biblical lecture. You wouldn't necessarily think that that would be the sort of thing that people would want to stop from being posted, but we're in very, very strange times. So that was my adventure for today. And so I didn't, I hate speakers who apologize to the crowd before they talk to them, because, if you're speaking to people and they put all this effort into coming, then you shouldn't tell them what a sorry and useless creature you are before you talk to them, and ask for their forbearance and forgiveness. It's like, you're a little late for that, but I'm still going to do that a little bit today because, I wanted to spend all day preparing this lecture. I mean, I've prepared it a lot beforehand, but that rattled me up a lot, and so I didn't prepare as much as I could have. Anyways, we'll stumble forward and see how it goes. I'm reasonably familiar with the stories now, and so onward and upward. So I'm going to reiterate this. I've learned something. I have this idea that it would be a good idea for young people and older people, citizens of the West, let's say, to learn more about their culture and their civilization, right? Because it's a great civilization, and it's taken a lot of work to put together. But I don't think that we really know. I know a fair bit about it, although I wouldn't consider myself nearly as educated as a person should be. But I'm not too badly educated. But I tell you, going through these biblical lectures, verse by verse, just makes me even more aware of how unbelievably ignorant I am. And partly for two reasons. Like, one is because I've been using this BibleHub.com place, and I think I told you last week, but I wanted to reiterate it because it's important. It's so interesting the way that they've set it up, because you can go through the biblical stories verse by verse, and then for each verse there's a whole small font page of commentary from multiple sources. And so, not only is the Bible hyperlinked in the way that I discussed in the first lecture, with all the verses referring to not all the other verses, but lots of them, but it's got its tendrils out into literature, direct commentaries on the text, but also all the literature that's been influenced by it. So it's an unbelievably central and core text. And it's so interesting to read a book where every sentence has been commented on, really in volumes, and then just to get a sense of that volume of material, how much power, brain power there's been put into this. And to also understand how bloody ignorant, I'm so ignorant about this. There's all this work, and it seems that we've left it to decay in the dust, and it's a big mistake, man. It's a big mistake, because the people who are writing these commentaries, a lot of it's from the 14th and 15th and 16th century. It's kind of archaic, and and some of it's outdated and some of it you wouldn't agree with, but if you read all the commentaries side by side, you get a pretty good blast of wisdom coming at you. And like the thing about wisdom is it stops you from running face first into walls. It's not just there so that you can talk to people at parties about what university you graduated from, and it's there because the information is unbelievably useful. One of the things that I've realized that I want to return to tonight, because I've been thinking a lot about this idea of the ark, and I think I mentioned to you last week that I'd figured out that there's this idea that Noah was perfect in his generations, and that meant that he had set his family in order. It wasn't just him, but he had set his family in order. And because of that, when the catastrophe came, like it comes to everyone, he was able to withstand it because he had the support of the people who were near and dear to him. And that's really important when things come along to lay you low. Like if you're alone and the flood comes, it's like, man, goodbye to you. If you've got 10 or 15 people supporting you in a tight network, and your interrelationships with them are pristine and you can tell them the truth and they can tell the truth back to you, it's possible that you might be able to find that thin way that will preserve you when the terrible things come knocking at your door. And so there's the idea of the ark is very, very concrete. In Noah, it's actually a structure that he inhabits. It's a concretized, almost like a child's story. And I'm not being cynical about that because there are some bloody brilliant children's stories, but it's really concretized. But then Abraham comes along, and instead of an ark, there's a covenant, right? Now, it says in the story of Noah that Noah walked with God, and of course Abraham, it isn't clear exactly that he's walking with God or before God, which we'll get into later, but you see, I see this as part of the increasing psychologization of the sacred ideas that were acted out by archaic people. So, first of all, it's concretized in the form of a ship that actually sustains you when the floods come, right? It's very concrete imagery, the sort of thing you might see in a movie. But then with Abraham, it turns into a psychological covenant in some sense. It's like a contractual agreement. Now, it's a contractual agreement between Abraham and God, but that doesn't really matter. Obviously it matters, but it's only half of what's important about that. The other half is that it's a contract. And, one of the things that you do with your ideal, let's say, is you establish a contract with it, and you also establish like a social contract with other people, right? That's what keeps society organized. And so there's this idea that emerges in the Abraham stories of a sacred contract, and that has the same function as the ark. And what it does, because what happens in Abraham, and we'll see more of this today, is that God tells him to go forward into the world, and we talked about that last week, and he does that, and he encounters famine, and he encounters tyranny, and he encounters powerful people who want to take from him what is his. God sends him out in the world, but it's not like he has an easy ride of it. It isn't easy at all. It's as hard as it can be. But there's this consistent emphasis in the text, and I think it's something really worth attending to, that if you maintain your contract, and that has to do with honesty and trust and truth and all of those things, if you maintain your contract, then you have a good possibility, the best possible possibility of making your way through the catastrophe and the chaos. And I don't want to be naive about this. When I read Jung and I started to understand the idea of the hero archetype, the idea that the human being is a force, a logos force that can stand up against chaos and catastrophe and tragedy and evil and prevail, I never did think that meant that if you did stand up and tell the truth, that you would necessarily prevail, right? It's not a magic trick. It's your best bet. That's the thing. You don't have a better option. And the idea is emerging in the Abrahamic text. It's like people are figuring this out. That would be progressive revelation. That's one way of thinking about it. And you can think about that in religious terms, but you can also think about it as humanity consulting itself, right? Each individual talking to themselves, which is what we do when we think, and each individual communicating with every other individual and gathering a body of wisdom that helps people orient themselves in the toughest conditions. And it's an incremental process, and I really do believe that that's speaking purely secularly. I do believe that that's what manifests itself in the biblical stories, right? It's the dawning enlightenment of mankind, something like that, as we start to understand the principles by which we have to live in order to orient ourselves properly in the world. So, and I also do believe, and this is the thing that's the unspoken question, is like, you don't have any idea how rich and fulfilling your life could be despite its tragedy and limitation if you stop doing the things that you know to be wrong. It's a really grand experiment. And one of the things that God tells Abraham constantly as the story progresses, especially every time Abraham makes a sacrifice, is God says, walk with me and be perfect. It's something like that. And so the injunction is, well, aim high, establish this relationship with the highest thing that you can conceive of, which you might as well do that because, well, what are you going to do? Establish a relationship with the most mediocre thing you can conceive of? Or you're going to establish a relationship with the lowest thing you can conceive of? People do that, and I wouldn't recommend it. It's a really bad thing, and there's a lot of pain associated with that. And maybe, there's pain that can expand into a world-destroying force down that route, and there's absolutely no doubt about that. So is there something superstitious and foolish about attempting to establish a contractual relationship with the source of all being? I mean, I just don't see that as an erroneous conception. And, it's not necessary perhaps to get lost in the details. We can argue forever about what God might or might not be, but we could at least say that the concept of God is an embodiment of humanity's highest ideal, right? We could at least agree on that. And then you might say, well, is that real? And the first thing I would say about that is, there's a lot of things about the world we don't understand. And the second thing I would say is, it depends bloody well on what you mean by real, that's for sure. And that turns out to be a very complicated question. So, okay, so we left Abram, remember at the end last time, he had just gone off to fight a bunch of kings and get his nephew back, which seemed to be a pretty courageous act. And so that brought a story to an end. And it's interesting. I think what happens in the narrative is that there's a story. So Abraham is somewhere and he goes somewhere else, right? That's a story. And he has adventures along the way. And those adventures are usually the typical kind of adventure, which is a rift in the structure of the story, an exposure to a kind of chaos and novelty, and then a reconstitution of the mode of being. So that's a classic story, right? You are somewhere, you're a certain way, you're moving forward, something happens that you don't expect, it blows you into pieces, it introduces chaos, right? You face the dragon, you get the gold, or maybe the bloody thing eats you and the story is over. And then you get to where you're going. But then the question is, well, what happens when you get to where you're going? And that's a really important issue, because one of the things that happens to people all the time in their life is that they get to where they're going, and then they don't know what to do, right? So, for example, you graduate from university. It's like, okay, story over. Who are you now? Who are you the next day? And so what happens is when you succeed, then there's a success crisis. And the success crisis is, well, I've run this story to its end. Now what? And that's exactly what happens in the Abrahamic stories. And they're punctuated by a period of contemplation and sacrifice. So every time an Abrahamic story comes to its end, then Abraham makes another sacrifice and communes with God, and then he figures out what to do next. And that seems right. It seems psychologically right, because what you should do when your story comes to an end, when you've achieved what it is that you want to achieve, or perhaps when you're in terribly dire straits, but we won't talk about that at the moment. When you've achieved what you need to achieve, then the next question is, okay, well, now I'm that person, or I have that character. What do I need to do next? And some of that is always, well, what do I need to give up now? What do I need to let go of so I can move to the next plateau, right? Assuming that your life is hopefully a sequence of upward moving, what would you call them? It's like Sisyphus, except you're actually, each time you climb up the mountain, you get a little higher on the mountain. It's something like that. So it's Sisyphus with an optimistic bent. And maybe if you push the rock up the mountain properly and let it roll down, and if you do that right, then it's okay. Every time you roll it back up, it's better in some sense. And I don't think that's unrealistic either. And so Abraham goes and rescues his nephew from these tyrannical kings. That's very brave, and he doesn't take any reward for it because as far as he's concerned, it's just a manifestation of the right thing. And then he has another vision. After these things, that's the battle, the word of the Lord came unto Abram in a vision, saying, Fear not, Abram, I am thy shield and thy exceeding great reward. And Abram said, Lord God, what wilt thou give me, seeing I go childless, and the steward of my house is this Eliezer of Damascus? And Abram said, Behold, to me thou hast given no seed, and lo, no one born in my house is mine heir. And behold, the word of the Lord came to him, saying, This shall not be thine heir, but he that shall come forth out of thine own bowels shall be thine heir. And he brought him forth abroad, and he said, Now look to heaven, and tell the stars, if you're able to number them. And he said unto him, So shall thy seed be. And Abram believed in the Lord, and he counted it to him for righteousness. And he said unto him, I am the Lord that brought thee out of Ur, the Chaldees, to give this land to you to inherit it. And he said, Lord God, whereby shall I know that I shall inherit it? And then he does this sacrifice. Take me a heifer of 3 years old, and a she-goat, and a ram, and a turtle dove, and a young pigeon. And then God comes down, and, Abraham goes into a trance. That's what it appears to be in the story, and has a great terror, and then God appears to him. And I'll just review this commentary again. This is from Joseph Benson. And when the sun was going down, that's about the time when you wash up for the evening, and he's praying and waiting towards evening. A deep sleep fell upon Abraham, not a common sleep through weariness or carelessness, but a divine ecstasy, that being wholly taken off from things sensible, he might be wholly taken up with the contemplation of things spiritual. Very strange, very, very strange series of interpretations, because it does seem that what happens to Abraham, that he falls into some sort of revelatory trance. And so, as I've taken some pains to explain, we don't really understand such things, and we can't rule out their existence because there's too much evidence that they do in fact occur. Perhaps it's a technology that we no longer possess. That's one possibility. Perhaps we no longer know how to access these sorts of states of consciousness. It's certainly possible. And lo, a horror of great darkness fell upon him. This was designed to strike awe upon the spirit of Abram and to possess him with holy reverence. Holy fear prepares the soul for holy joy. God humbles first and then lifts up. Yeah, well, I think that's right too. One of the experiences I've had in my life, fairly commonly, in a variety of different ways, this is especially true when I was paying a lot of attention to my dreams, which I did for about 15 years, I guess, something like that. Now and then I would feel like I'd learned some things and had sort of consolidated them, and then before I went to sleep, I'd think, okay, I'm ready to learn something else. And I didn't say that without trepidation, and because usually when you learn something, it's not that pleasant, because you usually learn something about why you're wrong. And the deeper the thing that you learn, the more you learn about why you're wrong. And there's a death that's associated with that, because then you have to let that part of you that's wrong die, and that's the sacrifice, right? And so you have to make a sacrifice. You have to be willing to make a sacrifice before you're going to learn something, and perhaps what you'll learn is in proportion to your willingness to make a sacrifice. And I really do believe that. I do believe that as well, because I also think that if you commit to something, that means that you don't do a bunch of other things, right? So that's the sacrifice of all those other things. You commit to it and you set your sights on it. If you really commit to it and you get the sacrifice right, so to speak, then the probability that that thing will be successful vastly increases. And I think that that's also not a naive or a naive way of thinking or a foolish way of thinking. My experience has been that that's the case. And so, back to the dream, I do think that we learn in trepidation, and that most of the time if you have to be laid low before the new revelation can make itself manifest. And I think that's also what happens to people often in psychedelic experiences when they have a bad trip, is they don't get through the bad part of it. And maybe that's because there's so much mess in their lives. Now, I'm speculating, but it's informed speculation. There's so much mess in their lives that the altered state of consciousness makes manifest that it's like a little trip through hell, but the mess is so complete and comprehensive and all-pervading that there's no way they can get through it. Now, if they could get through it and started to sort those things out, then there would be perhaps what would you call it? A compensatory positive revelation at the end. But the first thing is, if you want to learn something, is that you're going to encounter, well, you have to figure out what's wrong before you can figure out what wisdom you need next to guide yourself. And that's no laughing matter, right? And so I think that's what this refers to. I think that's the sort of psychological experience that refers to. I also think, we built this a little bit into the future authoring program. You know, I read this really cool paper once reviewed by this guy named Jeffrey Gray. Jeffrey Gray wrote a book called The Neuropsychology of Anxiety, man, and that is a great book. It is impossible to read. It took me like 6 months to read it. And the reason for that is that he reviewed about 3,000 papers, and they were all neurological papers and heavy psychological / biological papers. He actually read them all, and he understood them, and he synthesized them. And then he wrote this book about the synthesis. And he's very, very careful with his terminology. And so to read the book, you have to understand brain anatomy, and you have to understand neuropharmacology, and you have to understand animal behavior, the whole literature on animal behavior, and a whole whopping dose of human psychology and cybernetics. It's a vicious book, but you really learn something when you read it if you go through it bit by bit. And it's had an overwhelming influence on psychology, even among people who haven't read it, which is most of the people who cite it, by the way. And so, but he said, he outlined this real cool study, maybe it was a sequence of studies, about how to motivate rats, and rats are a lot like us, in positive and negative ways. And, biochemically and psychopharmacologically, they're very, very similar, and they have very complex social environments, and they have hierarchies, and they play, and they laugh. Jack Panksepp found out that rats laugh if you tickle them. You can tickle them with the end of a pencil eraser, but you can't hear them laughing because they laugh ultrasonically like bats. So you have to record it and then slow it down, then you can hear them giggling away when you tickle them. So which is, you think, well, you're going to spend $50,000 on a study demonstrating that rats laugh, and you think, well, wait a second, that's a major league study, because he's outlined a ludic circuit, that's a play circuit, and Jaak Panksepp discovered the play circuit in mammals. That's a bloody big deal, If you get that by rubbing rats with a pencil eraser, well, good for you. So anyways, Gray talked a lot about how to motivate a rat, and you might have heard about B.F. Skinner. He used food pellets to motivate his rats, but what you don't know about Skinner is that those rats were starved to 3/4 of their normal body weight. So they would work for food, man. So Skinner's rats were kind of oversimplified, but you can get rats to work for food. They don't have to be that hungry. You can get them to work for food, and they'll do all sorts of things. They'll press levers, and they'll open doors, and they'll solve problems, and they'll do all sorts of things. And one of the things you can do to kind of measure how much the rat is motivated is, let's say you've run him through a maze and he knows there's some food at the end of the maze. You can tie a little spring to his tail and see how hard he pulls when you open the door to the maze. So because that's how much rat work the rat is willing to do, so you can measure that. Or you can see how fast he skitters down the maze, and you can get an estimate about the rat's motivation. And so then you might say, well, how motivated is a hungry rat? And the answer would be, depends on how hungry he is. But there's another answer. It also depends on what's chasing him when he's going after the food. So if you have a rat and you have food over here and you waft in some cat odor, rats hate cat odor, and it's innate. They never have to see or smell a cat to be absolutely petrified by cat odor. And so if you waft in some cat odor and then open the door, that rat will zoom to that food a lot faster than it will if it's just hungry. So a rat running away from something that it doesn't want towards something that it does want is a very motivated rat. And so one of the things we did with the future authoring program that's germane to this idea of terror, because there's this idea in the Old Testament that the fear of God is the beginning of wisdom, and it's a pretty harsh idea. But there's something really useful about it, because one of the things you see with people all the time is that maybe they're trying to stumble forward towards their ideal, as poorly defined as it might be, but then they're afraid, right? They're afraid about what they might encounter, and that stops them, because fear does stop people. It freezes you like a prey animal, and so people move ahead, but then they get afraid, and then they stop moving ahead. And that's not so good because negative emotion is a really powerful motivator. So we're more motivated by negative emotion than positive emotion, quantitatively speaking. Quantitatively speaking, you can measure that. And that's, I think, because we can only be so happy, but we can really be suffering and dead, you know. So we have to pay more attention to the negative. And that's bad because the negative can stop you. And then in my clinical practice, you know, I often talk to people who are trying to make a difficult life decision, and they're weighing out the costs and the benefits of making the life decision, you know. And one of the things I always talk to them about is, wait a second, that's an incomplete analysis. You have to weigh out the benefits and the costs of doing this. And you have to weigh out the costs and benefits of not doing that, not doing it. And that's not the same as the zero that you assume that you're starting with, right? Because to not make a decision it also has a cost. And sometimes the cost of not making a decision is far worse than the cost of making a decision, even if the decision is risky. And so one of the things you can derive from that, and this is very useful, I think, is that this is also, I think, why it's so useful to contemplate your mortality, so to speak, is you're screwed no matter what you do. You know, and that actually frees you, is that you have path A that has catastrophes, and you have path B that has catastrophes, and you don't get to have the no catastrophe path, but you get to pick which one. And that's really something, because if you know that there's terrible risk associated with everything that you do and don't do, then you can afford to take some risks, because you're not, you know, and this is all within the ark metaphor. I'm still making the case that despite the fact that your life is essentially catastrophic, you can make a covenant with the highest ideal, and that will take you through it the best way possible. I'm still making that case. So then you think, okay, well, I'm trying to make this decision. I'm going to go try to do something difficult, and isn't that terrifying? And then you think, yeah, but wait a minute. What's really terrifying is not doing it. And then you think about the cost of not doing it. So in the future authoring program, we have people do this little meditative exercise, which is, okay, just think about your insufficiencies by your own definition, right? The way that you don't do what you know you should do. About the things that you do that you shouldn't do, that you know you shouldn't do beyond a shadow of a doubt, right? There's some things like that. And that's bad habits and poor aim and all of the resentment and hatred and aggression and unresolved conflicts and all those things that are dementing you and warping you, and then think, okay, those things get the upper hand, man. They get the upper hand, and they take you the worst possible place you could go in the next 3 to 5 years. What exactly does that look like? And so you sketch all that out, and you think, hey, I don't want to go there. And so the next time that a temptation comes up, you think, well, it'd be a lot better for me if I didn't succumb to this temptation. It's like, that's kind of weak, eh? You'd look a little better if you didn't eat like a cheesecake a day or something like that. You know, that's something, but it's not the same as I'm going to have diabetes and I'm going to lose my damn leg in 5 years if I don't get my eating under control. That's motivating. And so then the temptation comes along and you think, oh, how about no? Seriously, how about no? Not just because a higher good would be obtained if I avoided it, but because a terrible catastrophe would be averted if I didn't. And so, well, so you want to get your fear behind you, right? You want to get it behind you where it's pushing you forward instead of in front of you where it's stopping you. And you get your fear behind you, pushing you forward by actually thinking through the consequences of not putting your life together. And the least of those is that you waste it and suffer, right? Because you're going to suffer anyways, man. So you waste it and suffer. That's a bad deal. Because maybe if you're going to suffer, you could at least do something noble and glorious and upright and powerful and honorable and admirable and helpful and difficult. You know, that's just so much better. And maybe that's good enough so that you think, hey, you know, little suffering, it's basically worth it. At least it's a way forward, you know. At least it's a way forward. And he said unto Abram, know of a surety that thy seed shall be a stranger in a land that is not theirs, and shall serve those people, and they'll afflict them for 400 years. God, he's hedging his bets here a lot, right? He says to Abraham, well, go out, you know, into the world, and then he confronts him with a famine, and he confronts him with a tyranny, and with powerful people he wants to take his wife, and then he loses his nephew, and who he has a fight with, and then he has to go fight a war, and now, you know, he's reconstituting this covenant, and God says, yeah, you're going to have a nation is going to come from you, but they're going to be slaves to tyrants for like 400 years. It's like, he's not a great salesman exactly, but the thing about it is that, the thing that I like about it is that it's realistic, and you got to think too, because who knows why it is that the Bible exists or why people wrote it, but if they're going to sell you something, I don't know if this is the way to do it. Because unless you're a salesman who's sophisticated beyond belief, because you'd think that if it was just a matter of controlling the masses, let's say, which is one, say, Marxist interpretation of religion, or providing people with a primitive defense against death anxiety, which is essentially the Freudian interpretation, that you'd kind of make the deals that God cut with Abraham a little more on the positive and polished side, instead of making them a realistic offer constantly like they are. And that's part of the reason I think it is reasonable to treat the Bible as literature. It's more than literature. It's something other than literature. But you can treat it as literature, and I think the reason that you can treat it as literature is because the characters are all complex, including the character of God himself is complex and sophisticated. It's not one-sided. And it's paradoxical and incomprehensible at times, but I think good literature is like that, because true art, here's something about true art. This is something I learned from Jung. It's so smart. He was so smart. So imagine that you inhabit the land that you know, conceptually and practically, and then imagine outside of that, there's that massive space of things that you don't know. And even outside of that, there's the space of things that no one knows, right? So it's the known territory surrounded by the unknown. That's the canonical archetypal landscape. And the unknown manifests itself to you, and that's where new knowledge comes from. But the question is, how is that knowledge generated? And it doesn't just leap from completely unknown to completely articulated in one move. That isn't how it happens. It has to pass through stages of analysis before it becomes articulable. And the first stage of analysis, as far as I can tell, is that you act it out. So if something really surprises you, the first way that you react to it, your category is actually embodied. You'd like this. That's your first category. It's not conceptual at all. It's embodied. And then maybe you start to, like, you're at home at night and, something startles you and you freeze, and then it's dark, and then your imagination populates the darkness with whatever might be making the noise. And that's the sequence. It's like embodied response, imaginative representation, exploration, articulation. That's how information moves from the unknown to the known. And artists are the people who stand on that imagistic frontier, and they put themselves out into the unknown, and they take a piece of it and they transform it into some mythological image. And they don't know what they're doing exactly, because they're guided by their intuition if they're real artists. Otherwise, they're just propagandists. They have to be contending with something that they don't understand. And what they do is they make it more understandable, and then people gaze at those artworks, or they listen to the stories, and then they start to become informed by them, but they don't know how or why. I was at the Modern Art Museum of Art in New York. I'm afraid I don't remember which one, unfortunately, but I was in this amazing room. It had all these priceless paintings from the late Renaissance hanging in it. Each painting worth, who knows, $1 billion maybe. They're priceless paintings. So the room it's a shrine, and it was full of people from all over the world who were looking at these paintings. You think, well, what the hell are these people doing coming to this room looking at these paintings? Like, what are they up to? One of them was a painting of the Assumption of Mary, right? Brilliantly composed, and there was all these people looking at it, and I thought, what are they doing? They don't know what that means. Like, why are they looking at that painting? Why is it in this room? Why does it cost $1 billion? Why is that painting worth so much? And the answer to that is, well, we don't really know. Like, it happened. They're sacred objects in some sense, and we gaze at them in ignorance and wonder. And the reason for that is that the unknown shines through them at us and in partially articulated form. And so, well, that's the role of art. And that's the role of artists, And real artists are contending with the unknown, right? And they're possessed by it. They have a personality trait, openness, that makes them do that. They can't even help it. And I've had lots of creative people in my clinical practice, and I can tell you the worst thing for creative people is to not be creative, because they just die. And because it's like maybe you're a tree with a few major branches, That's your personality. So if you're extroverted, man, you can't be cut off from people, because you just wither. And if you're agreeable, you have to be in an intimate relationship or you die, And if you're conscientious, man, and you're unemployed, you're just going to eat yourself up because you have to have a duty and you have to carry a load because you just can't stand it otherwise. And open people have to be creative. They have to be, because otherwise they die. They don't have any vitality. And so they're cursed with the necessity of putting a foot out into the unknown and making sense of it. And then they're also cursed with the necessity of trying to make a living while they're doing that, which they can't, because you can't. It's almost impossible to monetize creative action, as many of you who are creative will no doubt find out. It's very, very frustrating. It's not that creative action is without value, right? Because the creative people are entrepreneurs, and the creative people revitalize cities, and the creative people make things magnificent and beautiful. You think about what's happened in Europe over the last 1,000 years, say 2,000 years, this amazing, unbelievable collaboration to make things so beautiful that they're jaw-dropping when you walk into them. And you think about the economic value of that, right? I mean, I think it's either France or Spain that's the most visited country in the world. It's one of those two. I think there's more tourists in France than there are people most of the time. And part of the reason for that is it's just so damn beautiful. You just can't stand it. And you think, what's the economic value of that? It's absolutely incalculable. And what's interesting too is that you build that beauty in, and then the farther away you get from it in time, the more valuable it becomes, right? Instead of decaying, it has exactly the opposite effect. Its value magnifies. And one of the things that I'm deeply ashamed of as a Canadian is that our sense of beauty is so underdeveloped. We're so primitive. It's not even primitive, that's the wrong word, because, I don't know what it is. It's second rate. It's second rate at least. It's terror too, because people are afraid of beauty. But the idea that art is... The conservatives really have a problem with this in particular, because conservative people tend not to be that creative. And it's a mystery by temperament. It's a mystery to me, because they should be concerned with economic development, and beauty is so unbelievably crucial to economic development that it just yells out at you, So anyway, so that's what artists are doing. And so one of the things I would say is buy a damn piece of art, Find one that really speaks to you, and buy a piece of art, because you invite that into your life, and it's a... Look out if you do it. If it's a real piece of art, because you'll also get a little introduction to the artist, and then that'll seep into your life, and that'll change things like mad. But it's unbelievably worth it, because it opens your eyes to the domain of the transcendent. That's the right way of thinking about it. A real piece of art is a window into the transcendent. That's what it is. And you need that in your life, because you're finite and limited and bounded, right, by your ignorance and your lack of knowing. And unless you can make a connection to the transcendent, then you don't have the strength to prevail. And that's part of the covenant. That's part of the covenant with God. And you can see that, because you look at these magnificent cathedrals that our civilization built over the centuries. Some of those, they're still building the Sagrada Familia in Barcelona, right? And it's an amazing building. I think it's going to take them like 300 years to build that. People in the Middle Ages, they'd start building a cathedral and they think, we'll be done this in 300 years. You imagine the vision that it took to invest in something like that. We look at quarterly reports. We can't think 300 years into the future to build something of that kind of remarkable, what? Those cathedrals are so, they're perfect. They're trees first, right? They're a forest, right? The Gothic cathedrals, they're a forest, and the sun is shining through the branches. That's the stained glass, and they're the perfect balance of light and structure, because they're representing something about the proper structure of being, which is something like the proper balance between light and structure. And they represent like the sacred tragedy of mankind. That's why they're in the shape of a cross, and they're open to the sky. That's why they have a dome, and they're full of gold so that it glitters, because that's like the city of God, and you can see that integral to our culture is the idea that beauty is one pathway towards God. And if you can't find another pathway, then why don't you use beauty? I'm sure most of you do that with music, because music is the one thing that modern people can't be cynical about. Thank God for that. And I've been fascinated by music because of that. It speaks meaning to people, right? Even nihilistic punk rockers are so damn engaged with their music that they can hardly stand it. And you can knock on them and say, look, you're having a transcendent religious experience, and they'll just tell you to fuck off, because that's... because that's what punk rockers have to do. But but that's still what's happening, you know. I mean, it's still what's happening. So, okay, so I got into all that because I was talking about the Bible as literature, you know, and trying to lay out, because we need in our culture to justify the arts. And I don't want to do that by talking about high culture, talking about something abstract and evanescent. That's the wrong way to go about it. This is vital. You know, like one of the things that's really interesting about the University of Toronto is that the one side of the campus where we are is beautiful, medieval cathedral, and the other side is god-awful factory. And, you know, and the thing is, the attitude towards knowledge has paralleled that architectural transformation. You know, at one point, the humanities, let's say, were a sacred endeavor, and so was the art of being educated in the university, and that's turned into, like, mass factory, and that's reflected in the architecture. This isn't accidental. None of this happens by random chance, you know. It's not like there's a conspiracy or anything, because there isn't, but that doesn't mean that these things aren't tangled together. And the loss of beauty in the universities is a catastrophe, because without that beauty, there's no call to higher being. You know, this is also why, you know, I've mentioned to people that they should clean up their rooms. That's become quite the internet meme. But I'm really serious about it, because it's really hard to do that. And I've been cleaning up my room, by the way, for about 4 months now, because my life was thrown into such a catastrophe, and also we were renovating. And so, but it isn't just that you clean it up, you also make it beautiful. And it's really hard to make something beautiful. And it's really worthwhile. And what's really cool is if you learn to make something beautiful, even one thing, if you can just make one thing in your life beautiful, then you've established a relationship with beauty. And then you can start to expand that relationship with beauty out into the world, like into other elements of your life. And that is so worthwhile. It's just incredibly, crazily worthwhile. And that's an invitation to the divine. You know, you have to be daring to do that. And people are terrified of it. People are terrified of color. They paint their walls beige. They're terrified of art. They buy some mass-produced thing because they don't want anybody laughing at them for their lack of taste. And they would get laughed at because they have no taste. But you have to, well, it's right, because what do you know, right? You have to develop it. And so you're going to stumble along and make mistakes to begin with. And you're going to show yourself, because if you buy, I think this is pretty, and, you know, somebody comes over and goes, hey, what's up with you? It's kind of hard on your self-esteem, but it's you're stumbling towards you're stumbling towards the kingdom of God. That's what you're stumbling towards when you try to make an aesthetic decision and to put something in your life that's beautiful. And it's unbelievably worthwhile to do that. And you have to steer clear of the frauds and the con artists and all of that. And art is full of that, of course, because it's difficult to distinguish between the real thing and the fraud, but it's unbelievably worthwhile. And so back to literature. I'm telling you this partly because I've been thinking a lot about the humanities and the arts. And practically speaking, because I know that artistic types are also entrepreneurial types. They're the same personality types. And so it's very much worthwhile to make an economic and practical case for this sort of thing. You study literature and the humanities so that you can familiarize yourself with the wisdom of our civilization. Man, you should do that, because people have been working on this thing for a long time, and it's rich beyond comparison. So why wouldn't you do that? And you teach yourself to read, and you teach yourself to speak, and you teach yourself to think, and you teach yourself to communicate. And I can tell you, if you can read and think and communicate, you are absolutely 100% unstoppable. And that's another thing that's so interesting about the humanities education that's at the core of the university. It's like there's nothing more economically valuable than teaching people how to articulate themselves and communicate, because they can identify problems, they can formulate solutions, they can negotiate to consensus, they can negotiate on their own behalf or on the behalf of others. It's like there's absolutely no downside to it, except that there's responsibility that goes along with it. But it doesn't matter, because there's no escape from responsibility. You can either take it voluntarily or you can take it involuntarily. Those are your options, but there aren't any other options. And so we need to understand the role of art and literature and stop thinking about it as an option. It's not an option. It's not an option. What is it said? Man does not live by bread alone. That's exactly right. We live by beauty. We live by literature. We live by art. And literally, not metaphorically. We cannot live without it, because life is too dismal and tragic in the absence of the sublime. So, and ourselves, we have to be sharp so that we can survive properly and orient the world properly and not destroy things, including ourselves. And so back to the Bible, which I do think is it's reasonably construed as a piece of literature because it's deep and because the people who wrote it had at least 1 foot in the unknowable. And they're trying to communicate what they experienced in the unknowable to make it known. And that's partly what we're trying to do in this series and what you're trying to do while you're listening and all of that. And so good for that. And also that nation whom they shall serve I will judge, and afterward they'll come out with great substance. There'll be a period of tyranny. You know, and there's a psychological truth to that too. One of the things I learned from reading Nietzsche, because you can learn a lot from reading Nietzsche, that's for sure. He talked about the Catholic Church. You know, Nietzsche is often construed as a great critic of Christianity, and he certainly was. But he was no casual critic. In fact, I think he was the sort of critic that you'd like to have as a friend, because he was the sort of critic that said, well, here's the great things you've done and that you could keep doing, but here's a bunch of really things that you did that you really should stop doing. And he talked about the Catholic Church, and he said what the Catholic Church had done to the European mind in particular was discipline it so that over a period of 1,000 years, 1,300 years, 1,400 years, there was this rule that there was a conceptual structure within which you had to interpret everything. And what that did was turn the educated European mind into a systematizing cognitive entity. And that once that systematizing cognitive entity had been established, then it could free itself from those underlying disciplinary structures and go off and do such things as produce the scientific revolution, for example, which required incredible systematic thinking. And so Nietzsche had this really interesting idea about freedom, and he believed that slavery was an intermediary between the undeveloped individual and the free individual, that you had to submit yourself to some intense disciplinary process for some period of time in your life before you could develop any true freedom. And so you think, maybe you want to learn to play the piano. It's like, that's not going to be any fun for a really long period of time, right? Because you're really bad at it, and there's a million things you have to memorize, and you have to stumble around like an amateur. And the same thing happens when kids learn how to read, and some of them never get past that point, and they never get to the point where they can enjoy reading. But in order to put yourself together, you have to put yourself in a vice and allow yourself to be constricted and mangled even by the thing that enslaves you. But the goal should be that as a consequence of submitting to the discipline, that you become disciplined. And then once you become disciplined, you can emerge from the disciplinary structure as someone who's free. And that's something that's very much worth thinking about as well. So that's illustrated conceptually in this piece of literature, let's say, because what the psychological meaning of what God tells Abraham is that all people are subject, and I mean not equally, obviously, all people are subject to the tyranny that precedes freedom. And that idea is repeated over and over in the Old Testament. It comes out most particularly in the story of Moses, right? Because, of course, that's the story of movement from tyranny. Where do you go from a tyranny? It's an absolute catastrophe. You go from a tyranny into the desert, where you starve. It's harsh. That's what happens in the story of Exodus. And so that's so interesting, too, because what it means is that sometimes if you're going to move uphill, the first thing that happens is you move downhill a lot. And so if you want to escape from the straits that bind you now, you're not going to move forward and go up. You're going to move forward and go down. And that's another reason, this is also something that Jung talked about a lot, is that, on the road to enlightenment, you encounter all the things that you don't want to encounter first, like all the weaknesses of yourself, all the realizations of the tyranny of the world and the catastrophe of nature and all of that. And so you step out of your encapsulation, your ignorant encapsulation, and it's immediate plummet into something that's a desert, let's say, where everything is chaotic and where you're wandering around without direction. A real catastrophe. So it's, because one of the things you might ask yourself is that if enlightenment is possible, then why aren't people enlightened? Because if it was just a matter of going from a good place to a better place, it's like, well, man, let's just get at it. It's no problem, right? Why would we ever stop doing that? But it seems not to be that. It's that you're here and that's not good and it's unstable, and you step out of it and it's like down to where you don't want to be. And you have to contend with that, and then maybe you can start your struggle upward. And so God is telling Abraham this, and he's also telling him that it's okay. It's rough, though. And thou shalt go to thy fathers in peace. Thou shalt be buried in a good old age. But in the 4th generation, they shall come hither again. That's the Israelites, the descendants of Abraham. For the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet full. God is going to leave the tyrants alone until they've manifested their full tyranny for reasons that we don't fully understand. And it came to pass that when the sun went down and it was dark, behold, a smoking furnace and a burning lamp that passed between the pieces. Albert Barnes said, the oven of smoke and lamp of flame symbolize the smoke of destruction, which we've already talked about, this catastrophe of the initial stages, and the light of salvation. They're passing through the pieces of the victims and probably consuming them as an accepted sacrifice, are the ratification of the covenant on the part of God, as the dividing and presenting of them were on the part of Abram. In the same day the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, unto thy seed I have given this land, from the river of Egypt unto the great river Euphrates. Now Sarai, Abram's wife, bare him no children, and she had a handmaid, an Egyptian, whose name was Hagar. So this is a big catastrophe for Abraham, especially in those times, and perhaps now as much, although perhaps people aren't as conscious of it as they once were. I mean, for Abraham, without a biological son, there was no vision forward into the future, and I mean, we don't really know what sort of time span over which these archaic people thought, but the medieval people, we already said, could think 300 years into the future without batting an eye. And these people who were concerned about their descendants were obviously thinking about existence in a way that wasn't just focused on their immediate existence, right? They were thinking about, well, their children and their grandchildren, and maybe their great-grandchildren, maybe the whole society that stemmed out from them. And that's smart. One of the things I learned from Piaget, at least in part, was that his idea of the equilibrated state, which he thought about as part of the biological basis of the idea of moral progress. It's something like that. He was very, very smart, Piaget. He said that the proper equilibrated state is one where, imagine you have a family, you got 5 people in it, and you're doing what you want in your family, what's good for you. But you're doing it in such a way so that the other 4 members of your family agree with what you do, and that it also facilitates them doing what they want and what they should be doing. And so it's a really tricky arrangement because it isn't just for you, it's for you in a way that's for them. And you could also see that would be something that would be a multiplier, right? Because if you have everyone working voluntarily towards the same common goal, then you get a multiplying effect of that. And then you might think, well, it's not just you and your family, it's you and your family today, and next week, and next month, and next year, and 10 years from now. So you have to take the time span into account. And then it should be you and your family in a way that works well in society. And then it should work well now and next week and next year and into the future. It should be iteratable, right? That's like sustainability. It's something like the idea of sustainability. And I would say that's a reasonable way of conceptualizing the holy city. It's something like that. If you're trying to make it concrete, it's like, how should you live your life? Well, let's say you live your life in a manner that justifies its limitation and tragedy. That's a good start. But then let's say that it does that in a way that also reduces the limitations and suffering of the people that you interact with, and now and into the future. Well, maybe there's a way to do that. I mean, a good negotiation does that, right? Because if you're negotiating with someone like your wife, for example, what you want is for her to agree with the negotiation. And one of the things that Piaget said, which I think was brilliant, he said, if you take an equilibrated system, a family, let's say, and a disequilibrated system, so that would be one where, let's say, the father is a tyrant and everyone is operating under his whip, and you put them in a head-to-head competition, the equilibrated system will outcompete the disequilibrated system because the enforcement cost is such that it will slow the system down. Because you'll get resistances from the people inside the system. The system will be working at counter purposes to itself, plus there's enforcement costs. And so a tyranny cannot beat an equilibrated system. And I was really excited to encounter that idea because when I encountered it, I was also trying to figure out if there was some quantitative difference between the systems, say, of the Soviet Union and Maoist China and the systems of the West, apart from just, arbitrary world interpretation as the postmodern nihilists might have it, if there was something fundamental at stake in the terrible Cold War that we fought, or if it was just a matter of opinion. And the Piagetian take was that, well, roughly speaking, is that the West was an equilibrated system. Not perfectly equilibrated, but reasonably equilibrated, in that people were essentially, even if they were slaves to some degree, they were at least voluntary slaves instead of involuntary slaves, and that was better. The system was actually technically better, and not just as a matter of interpretation. So that's a lovely thing to know, and I think it's a really, really solid idea. I haven't been able to, put crowbars under that idea and lift it up. I think it's a good one. So, now Sarai, Abram's wife, bare him no children. So, okay, back to children. Well, so one of the things that's worth thinking about with regards to reading these old stories, because we're very arrogant modern people, eh? We look at these old stories and we think, we've transcended all that superstition. It's like, don't be so bloody sure about that. These people weren't stupid. And so there are ways that they viewed the world that we don't have anymore. And one of them seems to be this concern for descendants, because that just isn't part of our way of thinking. We have a very short-term way of thinking. Maybe it's not even one lifetime long. It's certainly not multiple lifetimes long. And it isn't clear to me at all that that's for the best. And, the constant complaint that the environmentalists generate, some of which is justified and some of which is just anti-capitalist, anti-patriarchal nonsense that should be cleared out of that entire conversation, is that we need to take a longer view and consider more things in our purview when we act. And that's fair enough. Do we really want an ocean that has nothing in it but jellyfish? Because that's really what we're doing. And we're doing it very, very rapidly. And the data on that are very clear. And so, when you lift up your eyes and you make a connection with something that's transcendent, then that should bring more of the world within your purview. And maybe that's concern for the endless number of descendants that you might have. You might think too, well, if you're a successful person, if you have a successful family, God only knows how many people you will be the father of, right? It's completely, because you're a nexus, right? All sorts of things have come together in the cosmos to produce you. And then sorts of things manifest themselves from you. You have no idea what the potential consequences of your actions might be as they cascade across time, right? You have no idea. And so Abraham at least is concerned with these sorts of things, and God seems to be concerned too, because he promises Abraham that if he maintains the covenant, that the most important things that he needs will come to him. And they're pretty serious about this. So Sarai talks to Abram. She's not very happy about the fact that she can't have children. She says, "Behold, now the Lord hath restrained me from bearing. I pray thee, go in unto my maid. It may be that I obtain children by her." And Abram hearkened to the voice of Sarai. Well, that's not a very trivial thing, I wouldn't think. I don't imagine that Sarai was very happy about turning her maid over to her husband and potentially being usurped in the whole childbearing process, not in the least, but so it's also a major sacrifice on Sarai's part. There's no doubt about that. And of course, it's very difficult for us to talk about the ethics of the fact that Hagar was a more or less involuntary participant in this, but that was the times, absolutely the case. And of course, slavery and indentured servitude is the way of mankind, except in very, very limited circumstances. Carl Jung had something to say about that too, which I really liked. He said that part of the reason that modern people have, it's not the only reason, there's the Industrial Revolution, obviously, but part of the reason that modern people have been able to escape from the catastrophe of tyranny and slavery is because we've agreed to make ourselves our own slaves, right? So instead of owning a slave, you own yourself, in a sense, and so you trot yourself off to work and exploit yourself so that you can stay alive, and maybe it's not something that you want to do, but you've taken on the role of slave in some sense in relationship to your own survival instead of forcing someone else to do it, which is also something I think that's very noble about the West, is that we're willing to enslave ourselves as individuals, and we're not doing that to other people. Now, we're doing it to some degree, obviously, because the society is imperfect, but that's something that's very much worth thinking about. So, and Abram hearkened to the voice of Sarai. And Sarai, Abram's wife, took Hagar, her maid, the Egyptian, after Abram had dwelt 10 years in the land of Canaan, and gave her to her husband Abram to be his wife. That's the other thing that's been so interesting about doing this, one of the other things about doing this biblical series, and it's one of the things that's so cool about Google, despite the fact that they cut off my account. You can find any piece of art that ever existed on Google. And so that's great. So, when I'm trying to illustrate these lectures, I type in Abraham, Renaissance. And then like I get 200 Renaissance paintings. It's so great. And then I can look at them. And one of the other things that's so remarkable is that all of these, the major themes of these stories have been illustrated by people of spectacular mind-expanding talent, you know. There's just this endless array of, well, look at that. I mean, that's an amazing painting. And so, and there's, and of this, there's